Hello, my extraordinary pre-calculus class. We are ready for another online adventure. Today, we continue to talk about inverse trigonometric functions. And also remember that we use inverse trigonometric functions when we're looking for an angle measure. We have talked about these three inverse trigonometric functions: inverse sine, inverse cosecant, and inverse tan. And remember that when we did an inverse sine, cosecant, or tan, if the ratio is positive, we're going to get an angle between 0 degrees, 90 degrees, 0 radians, pi over 2 radians. And if the ratio is negative, we're going to get a negative angle between 0 degrees and negative 90 degrees, or 0 radians and a negative pi over 2 radians. Today, we will talk about our inverse cosine, our inverse secant, and our inverse cotangent. Here, if you're using a calculator or use a unit circle, if the inverse cosine, if the ratio is a positive number, you're going to get an angle that's in the first quadrant between 0 degrees and 90 degrees, or 0 radians and pi over 2 radians, or 0 radians and approximately 1.571 radians. If that ratio is negative, this time you're going to get something in the second quadrant between 90 degrees and 180 degrees, or pi over 2 radians and pi radians, or approximately 1.571 radians and 3.142 radians. So that's what you have to keep in mind. So let's look at some examples. We're going to use our calculator. Let's put the calculator in radian mode. We want to round to 4 decimal places if we need. So here we're looking for an angle whose cosine is a half. This is a positive angle, a positive ratio. So it's going to have to be in the first quadrant. So let's look at our unit circle. We're looking at our unit circle. Here we're in the first quadrant, and remember, cosine is the x-coordinate. So right here is an x-coordinate where we have a half for the cosine, and that's 60 degrees, which is what? Pi over 3. And that's what we have here, of a positive ratio. The angle is in the first quadrant. And we can check our answer by taking the cosine of the angle to see if we get that ratio, and we do. Let's look at a second example. Here we have inverse secant of a negative 2 divided by the square root of 3. Well, most calculators do not have an inverse secant, so we have to think about our reciprocal functions. So the angle whose secant is negative 2 over square root of 3 is the same angle whose cosine is a negative square root of 3 over 2. So we're going to be looking in the second quadrant because the ratio is negative. So let's look at our unit circle. And we're in the second quadrant right here. And we're looking for a cosine. You see that it's a negative square root of 3 over 2. And that's 5 pi over 6 radians, or 150 degrees. So again, when the ratio is negative, we're getting an angle that's in the second quadrant, a positive angle that's in the second quadrant. Then we can check this. Remember that, again, a lot of calculators do not have the secant, so we have to go back and think about our reciprocal functions. So the secant of 5 pi over 6 is the same thing as 1 divided by the cosine of 5 pi over 6, which gives us negative 2 over square root of 3. So the angle measure gives us the ratio. Let's look at a third example. We'll look at inverse cosine of a negative 0.47. Well, here the ratio is negative. So we're looking to get something that's in the second quadrant. And we're getting approximately 2.0601. And that is between, remember, that is between a negative, let's look at our unit circle for just a minute. But remember, this pi over 2 is like a negative 1.571 radians, and the pi is approximately, what, 3.142 radians. So that 2.0 is going to be in this, what, second quadrant. Let's look at a fourth example. If you put this into your graphing calculator, you're going to get an error. And the reason you get an error is because the ratio is outside of the domain of the inverse sine function. Let's look at that. Remember when we were looking at our inverse sine function, the domain was between what, a -1 and 1, and 1.5 you see is over here outside of that range. So that's why you were getting that error. And remember, when you're viewing these videos, remember to stop, rewind, review. Stop, rewind, review. My love going out to you.